Good morning. We are on week 5 of our Cornerstone study of the year, Christ's dual nature in John's Gospel. And we are at chapter 7 of the Gospel of John. Now, this could be basically divided up in this chapter in two sections. One of them is pre-festival, and the other is festival. Now, the middle part of John, right up until, think about chapter 12, he ties his narrative very closely to different festivals of their season. And chapter 7 starts just before the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, where it was considered one of the 3 great festivals of the year that Jewish men were expected to report to. And here's the thing. Last time he was in Jerusalem for a festival, they developed a plan to kill him. So since then, he has been, as chapter 7 begins, going about in Galilee, not Judea, way up in the north. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Good reason. It's not time for that yet. He still has work to do. But, as I said, the Feast of Booths is at hand, and there are certain expectations around what a Jewish man was supposed to do at that time. But as we'll find, there are other expectations hanging about Jesus. His brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." Now, you'd think this is kind of one of those advice on how to succeed from people who want to see you succeed. But John follows up with another one of his asides in verse 5. Not even his brothers believed in him. So what do we have here? They didn't understand what he was there for. They're thinking, you want to be a public figure? You want to do miracles? Why not go where the people are? Not that there weren't any people in Galilee, but I heard somebody once describe it as going about trying to become a public figure in the boondocks as opposed to, say, London or New York, Los Angeles, somewhere where there were masses of people in a center of some sort of influence. And this is what they're saying. If you really are something special in, say, in the prophetic way or even in the messianic way, you should make something of this. There's also this nuance that what was done in secret could be considered deceitful, shameful, whereas public action was known as straightforward and truthful and trustworthy. Although we know that there are many people who do things very publicly and yet very deceitfully. And we know that Jesus said, don't let your deeds of benevolence be done to be seen. But the main thing here is that they also are just thinking public political Messiah. Jesus' response to them could be considered a little harsh. And yet, there's some really significant truths in this. He said to them, my time has not yet come, but your time is always here. So that's the first one. God has his own timing, and Jesus is following God's schedule. Whereas for them, for their purposes, any time is good enough. And when I was thinking about this, I couldn't help but think, how many times do I get impatient with God for not acting on my time schedule? And then I read, your time is always here. My time has not yet come. God has his own timetable. And to be like Jesus means to wait on that schedule. But there's a second thing here, he says. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. Now, what had they said? If you do these things, show yourself to the world. Now, if you've been paying attention, you know that the word world in John has a special significance. The world being what they call unregenerate, unsaved, and not inclined to be saved humanity. So their time is always here, meaning their time isn't God's time. But they also are not hated by the world. We'll find out later. Jesus promises his disciples, those who believe him and follow in him, in his steps, that the world will hate them because it hated him first. And here he says the world cannot hate you. They belong to the world. They don't belong to him. Now, in a culture where family ties were intrinsic to society, were your very identity, to say that to your own mother's sons. If you don't know the rest of the story, it could be considered really discouraging. But anyway, he finishes by saying, you go up to the feast. I'm not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. And there's some issues with this in English because of what happens late in another couple verses. Because after he tells them this, he remains in Galilee. And then verse 10 says, but after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. And people are like, well, was he lying? Was there some sort of mistake made here? But in the Greek, that I am not going implies I'm not going now, as you asked. This is the present moment. I am not. And in some English translations, they do add not now going, because English is a bit lacking in verb tense variety. But that's really what it means. Not going with you now. So they go, and he waits until God's schedule moves him. And it puts him a few days late, which for people who are very attuned to punctuality was like, late, he's late. But here's what he walks into. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, where is he? And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said he is a good man, others said, no, he's leading the people astray. Yet, for fear of the Jews, meaning the Jewish leaders who said whether or not you were allowed to take part in the life of the synagogue, the heart of your community, For fear of these people, no one spoke openly of him. So here's the pre-festival lead up. You know, after that, this is not going to be your ordinary religious festival. And then we come against a couple different, what you might call cycles of the same behavior. Jesus teaches, there's debate, and his enemies fail to arrest him. And this begins in verse 14, chapter 7. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. Now, of course, your first thought might be, well, if you went up privately, what's the point in going out and acting publicly? Again, pointing you to God's schedule. And as proof of that, remember, he just walked into a place where people in charge are actively seeking to find a way to arrest and kill him. He walks into a public place, the heart of their seat of power, and begins to teach. And this does not escape their notice. The people who hear him are marveling that, well, how is this man so learned when he's never studied with anyone? And Jesus, this is, of course, we don't know what exactly he was teaching to trigger this. But his answer to them is, my teaching is not mine. You see, normal teaching of the day tended to lean very heavily on reference sources. Rabbi so-and-so always said, and the traditions cite that, which is supported by the opinions of such and such a great teacher. Jesus just said, I say to you, right? His key phrase, truly, truly, I say to you. And there's no reference to previous authorities. So he's explaining to them that when he says, I say to you, he's not just saying it of his own authority, which would be incredibly, in their eyes, incredibly egotistical. I tell you. But he says, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. Now, remember with John, every time Jesus says, like, he who sent me, or him who sent me, his who sent me, who's he talking about? He's talking about God the Father. Here's the key. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he'll know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there's no falsehood. So here's the key to the source of his teaching. Where does he get this learning? Well, he gets it from the one who sent him. And him who sent, if you remember earlier in John, the one who sent and the one who was sent are one. But to address some of their other concerns, has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? Okay, so secret conspiracy, secret no longer. He's announcing. You can almost imagine that he's looking at the edges of the crowd where quite possibly several of the Jewish leaders have been coming over saying, oh, here he is. We found him. And now, why do you seek to kill me? Now, mind you, one of the foundational commands of the law is you shall not commit murder. Yet, contrary to the law, without procedure or proper legal maneuvering, they're trying to kill him. And of course, the crowd, these are the non-leaders, probably out-of-town people, are like, you have a demon. You are, it's more than you're crazy. It's you are in collusion with forces of evil if you say because they're like, who is seeking to kill you? And they're from out of town. Understandable that they probably haven't picked up on that yet. And so he goes back to a previous work done. Verse 21, I did one work and you marvel at it. Probably he's talking about from chapter 5, the last time he was there at a feast and he healed that physically disabled man by the pool of Bethsaida. I did one work, you marvel at it, and their marveling, if you remember, was not of the, wow, that was amazing and wonderful, but wow, he broke the Sabbath. And he says, Moses gave you circumcision, but remember, not for Moses, it was pre-law. This is all the way back to Abraham. This is from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. So if on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken. Now, you have to remember, he's arguing here that even in their own practice, certain parts of the law took precedence over others, and circumcision was considered an action that made perfect one, just one aspect of the life of a Jewish male. And so when he says, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? He's saying, for this one part of the law, you're willing to break another part of the law because you consider this part more, this circumcision, to be of more urgency, more importance than the Sabbath. You are angry because I made a whole body well on the Sabbath. There's a point here that even in their own practice, they acknowledged that, how do I put this? The life, the health, the wholeness of an individual in one aspect was more important than the blanket command not to do any regular work on the Sabbath. And yet, when he heals on the Sabbath, they're angry with him. So he comes down on them with, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. And here begins some more murmuring. Is not this the man whom they seek to kill? This is the people of Jerusalem, mind you, not just the general crowd. So you get the feeling that if you lived in the area, you had an inkling of what was going on under the surface. But here's the funny thing. After, is not this the man they seek to kill? Here he is speaking openly, and they say nothing to him. Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ? Of course, in the Greek, this is one of those rhetorical questions that assumes an answer of no, because we know where this man comes from. And when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from. There was a tradition. This isn't stated anywhere in Scripture, but there was a tradition that the Christ would come out of nowhere, out of hiding, as it were, and would appear and would do great things and would rescue the people. But here's the problem. They know where this guy comes from. And worse yet, he comes from Galilee. So Jesus proclaims as he teaches in the temple, you know me and you know where I come from. You're like, you think you know? But I've not come of my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. So it's kind of like, you think you know me, you don't really. You think you know God, but you don't. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me. And here we go, right? Again, with the timing. Verse 30, they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. Yet many of the people believed in him. There is always a connection between God's timing and the work to be done. And in this case, we are given front row seats to the fact that God will not allow the authorities to act as they choose because there are still people who have not heard. Because some of them will believe. And I love the question, when the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done? You're like, well, even if he isn't the Christ, the way we think of Christ, I can't imagine anyone being more like the Christ than this man. So here's your first cycle right there. They tried to arrest him. They couldn't. And it begins again. Because, of course, when people say things like that, they tend to be overheard. And the Pharisees hear the crowd muttering these things about him, and the chief priests and the Pharisees, they're like, all right, we got to do something. So they send officers of the temple to arrest him. And Jesus is then saying, I will be with you a little longer. Then I'm going to him who sent me. You will seek me and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come. Now this is perplexing. And they start asking, well, where's he plan to go? Where we can't find him. Is he planning on, going out amongst the dispersions? Is he going to out among the Greeks? So basically he's like, what is he planning on, hiding himself among the Gentiles? Which is kind of ironic, intentionally so, I believe, because where does the gospel end? Well, it goes out to the Gentiles. But they're asking themselves, what does he mean by saying this? What does he mean? So on the climax of the feast, this is the last day, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. Now you have to remember, or you have to understand the context. Now you remember we talked about the last time when there was a feast, there was just before the Passover, and he was talking about the bread of heaven. Well, there was this thing about the tabernacle. I found in one of my commentaries a really interesting description of it. That on the 7 days of the feast, a golden flagon was filled with water from the pool of Siloam and was carried in a procession led by the high priest back to the temple. As the procession approached the water gate on the south side of the inner court, 3 blasts from the shofar were sounded. While the pilgrims watched, the priests processed around the altar with the flagon, while the temple choirs singing the Hallel. And when they reached Psalm 118, every male pilgrim shook, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce that because it's in Hebrew, and I don't do Hebrew, but it's a bundle of willow and myrtle twigs tied together with a palm branch. And he shakes it in his right hand, while his left raised a piece of citrus fruit, a sign of the ingathered harvest. And all cried, give thanks to the Lord, 3 times. And the water was offered to God at the time of the morning sacrifice, along with the daily drink offering of wine. The wine and the water were poured into their respective silver bowls and then poured out before the Lord. And these ceremonies of the Feast of Tabernacles were related in Jewish thought, both to the Lord's provision of water in the desert. Remember when the water came out of the rock for them, and to the Lord's pouring out of the Spirit in the last days. So pouring at the Feast of Tabernacles refers symbolically to the Messianic age in which a stream from the sacred rock would flow over the whole earth. So when Jesus stands up at the very end of the feast and he cries out things like, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." He's making a very special and timely declaration. They've spent the whole week watching this ceremony that not only looks back toward the provision of God to their ancestors in the desert, to the present, where God provides rain for this harvest that they've just gathered in, but to the future, mentioned in places like Ezekiel 47, where he talks about the temple and rivers of water flowing out from under its threshold. Or Isaiah, come, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and he who has no money, come buy and eat. They've spent the whole week with this in front of their eyes. And then this man from Nazareth stands up and says, "Come to me, and I will give you living water." And John's aside after this makes sense then in that light, right? This he said about the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive, for as yet the Spirit had not been given because Jesus was not yet glorified. So the feast has reached its climax. Jesus has started crying out things like, "Come to me and drink, I'll give you living water." And the debate begins again. Should say resumes. Some people said, "This really is the prophet." And others said, "This is the Christ." But some, excuse me, who thought very highly of their biblical knowledge said, "Is the Christ to come from Galilee? Has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the offspring of David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was?" So there was a division among the people over him. And some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. Again, implied, it's not time yet. And this is it's almost like the punchline to this particular part of the cycle, because if you remember, the officers of the temple had been waiting for an opportunity to arrest him, and they go back empty-handed. Verse 45, the officers then came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, "Why did you not bring him?" And the officers said, "No one ever spoke like this man." The Pharisees said, "Have you also been deceived? Have any of the authorities or the Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd, these commoners who do not know the law, they're cursed." But Nicodemus, name we should recognize, trying to be the voice of reason here, says, "Does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does?" And they're not in the mood for reason, though. "Are you from Galilee too?" Fine, let's insult the reasonable person. Sure. "Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee." Well, technically, the region had given rise to several prophets, but their dander is up. They are not in the mood to be accurate. And we're going to skip. We are going to skip the first part of chapter 8, largely because earliest manuscripts don't include it. Other manuscripts put it in various places in the gospel, and right now it just kind of breaks the flow. So forgive me, but we're going to skip down to verse 12 of chapter 8, because Jesus is saying, "I am the light of the world." There was also a very strong aspect of light to this festival. They had a similar ceremonial recognition of the pillar of fire that accompanied the people of Israel by night, which was cloud by day. And so water and light were a massive part of this festival. He's already said that he's the source of living water. Now he says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And you find immediately that he is face to face with his enemies when he's saying this. The Pharisees said to him, you're bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true. Well, teaching was short. Debate begins sharply and quickly. We've already talked in John about how he says, the works I do, they testify for me. John testified for me. Here he narrows it down. Even if I do bear witness about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I come from and where I'm going. But you do not know where I come from or where I'm going. You judge according to the flesh. This is back, go back and say, judge not by appearances, but with right judgment. You judge by appearances. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for it is not I alone who judge. Can you see the tension between his apparent nature, the physicality of his humanity, and then his divine nature that he knows perfectly well, but they cannot see. They will not see. Because he's talking about, I am not alone. My Father who sent me, he and I judge, speak. What's their response to this? Where is your Father? Like, yeah, you wouldn't know, would you? You don't know him. You know neither me nor my Father. It's interesting. That he's saying this in the treasury, in the temple. All this time, how many times has it said they sought to arrest him, but they didn't? And yet, where does he keep popping up? In their stronghold. And so we finish this off by saying, these words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. It's like, this is the chorus and refrain we keep coming back to. Next week, we are going to go further into, because we have this is all bound up together. His teaching, and then the next sign that he performs, the man born blind, healed. So for next time, if you would start reading chapter 8, verse 21, and then on through the end of chapter 9. That should do it.